Welcome everyone to the Strand Group at King's College London. I'm its director, John Davis, and tonight's lecture is in wonderful partnership with the Attlee Foundation, and we welcome Sir John Major. What does the Strand Group do? Well, we've been running events like this for over 20 years now, and I think, Sir John, you gave one previously for us in the Foreign Office, but I also remember a particularly good one back in our Queen Mary days when you were talking about the early years of cricket. And I think that was a particularly well-received evening, that one. Somebody did say that only the finest prime ministers like cricket. Right? What does the Strand Group do then? So it does these events, and you're all so welcome. We also do research. We've got all kinds of PhD research into the nature and practice of government. But what we have come to more and more is to focus on our teaching. And we've got a brand new video that we'd like to show you. Run VT, please, Martin.
We get Ed Balls, Nick McPherson, who was a permanent secretary at the Treasury. You can use them in your essays. You get these people, they come in, they're very candid about their experiences.
Meeting everyone on the course, we've all come from such different backgrounds. Like, obviously lots of people have history and politics backgrounds, but lots of us have done journalism or English, or like me doing law.
As soon as the lecturer started talking, I felt the passion, I felt that knowledge. I'm here, I'm with a big smile, I'm just enjoying it so much.
There's been plenty of locational variety and different speakers. We went to the Guildhall, so we met with some people from the City of London Corporation, so we learned about that as an organisation. We went to City Hall to learn more about London local government and the evolution of the mayoralty. We met one of Sadiq Khan's deputy mayors.
It teaches you government policy from the perspective of crisis and crisis management, which is very important. There's understanding theory, there's understanding policy, and then there's knowing how to deal with the problems. And I feel like the government studies course really emphasises that.
You do have a genuine relationship with your lecturers, and you can challenge them on ideas. You can say, well, what about this? So it does work really well.
Such a big access to get. They're just there, they're in your class. They're showing up every week. We've got to actually speak and hear from the people who are involved, which you don't get anywhere else.
Straight from the horse's mouth. Spread the word, please. We are very proud of this MA. A particular focus of the MA is and has been for a very long time. These modules have been running for over 30 years now, first with Professor Peter, now the Lord Hennessy. So a particular focus is on the history and nature and decision making of prime ministers. So tonight is particularly apt. It was my pleasure to be on the board of the Attlee Foundation for several years at the start of the 2000s, and so it's my very great pleasure to introduce back to us its chairman, Alan Evans. Alan.
Thank you, John. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming here for this Attlee Foundation lecture. It's a really great honour and privilege to be here. My name is Alan Evans. I've been chair of the Attlee Foundation for the last 10 years. And just briefly, I'd like to say what the foundation does. We were created in 1967 on the death of the Earl Attlee, and we essentially have existed to do two things. One is to keep the memory of Attlee alive and what he stood for, and secondly is to support projects that he would have approved of, we think, particularly for disadvantaged people in the East End of London. In the past, we supported setting up the Attlee Youth and Community Centre in Tower Hamlets, and at the moment, we are looking to build our programme of Attlee Foundation bursaries, which give money to disadvantaged bright youngsters in East London in partnership with our school, we work with the Attlee Sixth Form College and funded by the Aldgate and All Hallows Foundation. And we think that's the type of thing that Attlee would have approved of. But tonight we're here to listen to Sir John Major speak. Sir John, we're delighted you've agreed to give this lecture. We're sure you get many such offers, so it's very kind that you've taken this one up. As they say, Sir John needs no introduction, and you're not going to get one. If you don't know him, look him up in Wikipedia. I'm sure you can find out the details. I did last night just do a little bit of statistical analysis, and I noted that the last 5 Prime Ministers, on average in the UK, have survived for 1 year and 11 months. Sir John, you managed 6 years and 5 months, although it must have felt more like that sometimes. And the other thing that I noted, which I didn't know till yesterday, is that Sir John was Prime Minister for 63 days more than Lord Attlee was, so quite an achievement. I suspect you would have liked his parliamentary majority some of the time. But without more ado, Sir John is going to talk about a pivotal year for democracy, and I'd ask you to welcome Sir John Major to deliver the Attlee Foundation Lecture. Thank you.
Well, Alan and John, thank you very much indeed. First of all, I'd like to thank the Attlee Foundation for inviting me to be here this evening to deliver this lecture. I'm very privileged to be here and delighted to be at King's, where I feel very much at home. It's now a quarter of a century since I left frontline politics, but I still have an observer's interest, perhaps one might call it, in our world and our country. Both are in an uneasy state, and actions or inactions this year may be pivotal to the future. Now, let me right at the start do a little house cleaning. Some may be surprised that a former Conservative Prime Minister would deliver a lecture in honour of a former Labour Prime Minister. They shouldn't be, and in a world of grown-up politics, they wouldn't be. It's easy to admire Clem Attlee for his record of achievement, his political courage, his resolute defence of our country's values, so important today, his creation of the National Health Service, his commitment to public service more generally, and the manner in which he put the interests of his country before his own or those of his party. Now, of course, if we were both in politics today at the same time, there would be differences of policy, of priority, of philosophy. We are political opponents. But mark this, opponents, yes, enemies, no. Democratic parties do have enemies in politics, but they are the populist insurgents who seek to divide and not unite our country. Populists are careless of the strife they cause. They trade on grievance in our society, and where ills exist, they exaggerate them. And having exaggerated them, they then blame those ills on minority groups of a different race or a different religion. It is ugly politics, and it should have no place in our political society or in our country. Our political system would work to better effect, and frankly, it would be more honest if mainstream politicians acknowledged that their priorities, I emphasize priorities, have far more in common between the main parties than they wish to admit. Now, if that surprises you, consider this. Each of our 3 main parties are in favour of greater economic well-being, secure defence, decent public services, thriving health provision, affordable housing, flourishing education, and healthy employment. And that is what we expect in our liberal democracy. And when those priorities are not delivered, the nation becomes disenchanted, as it is at the moment. Now, we're not alone in that disenchantment. Over the last 2 decades, democracy has been retreating in almost every part of the world. Nearly 3/4 of our world live outside democratic protection. Autocrats undermine democracy to entrench themselves in power. And if we don't recognize the dangers of that and protect ourselves against it, autocracy may one day overwhelm us as well. Now, at my age, I have a limited lease on the future. But let me say with all the force I can muster, if we were to cast aside our mainstream politics and our mainstream politicians, as polls sometimes suggest we may do, then a gap would open up, and that gap may not be filled by other Democrats. So if you rejoice, any of you, at the dire polling of Labour and the Conservative Party at the present, or the Liberals for that matter, beware of what you wish for. If they were to fall, who knows what will rise. You may find that autocrats in power do not share the democratic instincts of the politicians that you have discarded. At the moment, there are many people who worry about our future. They're concerned at what lies ahead. Some are bewildered, others frightened by the changes they see as they look around our country and our world. It would be a self-inflicted wound if they turned to the extremes of politics because democracy, to their mind, was not speaking for them. We know that democracy can succeed. We know it can succeed in the most unpromising circumstances, and we know that because the Attlee government proved it 80 years ago. Recall a crippling war and a country that was nearly bankrupt. The war had enhanced our reputation for courage and persistence, but left our immediate prospects in tatters. 6 years of conflict had left families bereaved, cities destroyed, and the exchequer bare. The British people had endured years of hardship. The age of deference was on its deathbed, and our battle-weary predecessors demanded a brighter future. In retrospect, 80 years on, the 1945-50 government and its Prime Minister are held in high regard. The problems they, and after them their successors, faced and overcame should be an inspiration to what could and should be achieved today. But there's no room for complacency. No reason for the careless assumption that many make that democracy is so entrenched that it cannot be undermined. It can, and around the world, it is undermined. Electors should treat with suspicion rash promises from infant parties that have never experienced the complexities of democratic government. Our liberal democracy is not perfect, but it is far preferable to any of the alternatives that I have seen in any part of the world. It has checks and balances unknown to other systems of government. It has the ability to dismiss the inadequate and haul down the overpowerful. And it exists to serve the nation. It does not compel the nation to serve the state. Our political system is an enabler. Its policies enable peace, resist war whenever possible, and promotes justice, well-being, growth, care where needed, enhance life expectancy, and transformation of life opportunities. Now, it is human. Along the way, it makes mistakes, but its purpose is to extend freedoms of choice and action that more extreme politicians would soon curtail. But, and it's a big but, we cannot ignore the uncomfortable truth that in recent years, our democracy has fallen short of the expectations of the nation. People have faced higher costs and rising taxes. They've seen no real increase in their post-tax income, nor in their standard of living. When, over a period of many months, our three mainstream parties, Labour, Conservatives, and Liberal Democrats, collectively barely register 50% in the opinion polls, it is time to be concerned about what may lay ahead. In a bid to reassure electors, politicians sometimes talk of reforms to come. It's a useful word, reform. It can mean anything or nothing. Reform means change. Change means upheaval. Upheaval provokes opposition. Now, upheaval may be necessary, but sometimes it seems to me, and maybe I'm very old-fashioned about this, sometimes it seems to me it is better to make progress on the everyday issues of policy before you tear up some new, old, established system and replace it with something new. Is policy strangling initiative or encouraging? What do you think? Are tax levels deterring savings and investment? What do you think about that? Is planning holding back housing for the homeless and the would-be homeowner? Does the benefit system encourage or discourage unemployment? Can the triple lock be targeted specifically to pensioners who really need it, rather than it being universal? Can Parliament act more strongly against the misuse and abuse of social media, and if so, how? Can we fund the armed services we need? Will that mean more spending or savings elsewhere? What do you think? There is certainly no shortage of conventional issues to settle, but it's not only policy that needs updating. If I may say so, so does our political system itself. Politics has a grubby underbelly that can make it look seedy. We need a spring clean. Is political funding corrupted if, with no qualifications other than money, donors receive honours or preferential access to ministers? Should political donations be capped to protect against undue influence? I believe the answer to those questions is yes. Should the House of Lords be elected or appointed? An elected upper house is popular with many. It would meet democratic aspirations. But it would be a monumental mistake. It could and would challenge the primacy of the House of Commons and create constitutional confusion. And it would do worse than that. It wouldn't retain the wisdom and lifetime experience to enable it to discharge its primary function, that of revising and improving our legislation. It would not be a partner to the Commons, it would be a rival to the Commons. And the sooner that is understood right across the House of Commons, the better. Recent general elections have thrown into doubt the continuing validity of our system of voting, the first past the post system of voting. As voting preferences spread more widely, it provides distorted results. The democratic case for examining this is growing, although changes would come with distinct drawbacks and would come very reluctantly from any of the major parties. Should members of Parliament who defect to a different party be compelled to face a by-election? Constitutionally, the answer is no, because they're deemed to be elected as individuals. In the real world, they are elected as representatives of a political party. So yes, logic and common decency suggest people crossing the floor in the House of Commons after being elected for one party must face the electorate again in another party if they move to that party. If the House of Commons wishes to regain the respect it has lost and update itself to modern society, I believe it must either justify the status quo or change it in the directions I have been talking about. And one further thought, and one's not supposed to say this in public, it's frowned on in many quarters, but is it really not time to recognise that Brexit has failed to deliver its many promises, and the loss each year of £100 billion of European trade and £40 billion of tax revenue is doing enormous damage to the lives and livelihoods of the British people and their future? Money is the root of good public services. Imagine how much better they, and our military power for that matter, might be if that money was still available to the Exchequer instead of being thrown away with such a casual disregard of the consequences. I don't believe we can fully rejoin the European Union in the near future. But economic well-being tells us we should rebuild relationships with our closest neighbours as swiftly and as comprehensively as we can. When we left the European Union, we broke up a European alliance of 500 million people. We did so as America, with its 340 million citizens, pivoted away from us to the east. So suddenly we were in a different position. Our closeness both to the European and American power blocks was reduced. And that left the UK more solitary and more vulnerable. My father was born in the many, many years ago. My father was brought up in America and he taught me to admire the virtues of that great republic. Our two countries saw the world through similar eyes and had much in common. But that relationship, once rock solid, is now more nuanced and more distant. After World War II, the Marshall Plan helped rebuild shattered European economies, and in the post-war years, America was the rock upon which democracy prospered. America's influence was overwhelmingly benign when President Truman committed to, and I quote directly, to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. America's purpose, echoed by later presidents, was to secure a freer and safer world in which the strong pledged their protection to the weak. No fee was asked, no deal was demanded, no investment or payment was expected. It was altruistic policy in a harsh world. It was what made America great. I saw this at first hand at meetings in the White House and Pentagon when the most senior military personnel of both countries were present. Their mutual respect and friendship was self-evident. Trust was instinctive and total. Nothing was held back. They spoke as though they had been together all their lives. Our political and military relationship was one of shared values on every single issue from human rights to free markets. So I know what we had, and I deeply regret that it seems to be falling away. Since the turn of the century, America has economically outpaced both the United Kingdom and the European Union. At the millennium, the GDP of America and the European Union was similar. Today, America is half as big again. But there is now a new tone from America. President Trump argues that America is being ripped off by trading partners. And without consultation, he raised tariffs on imports from wealthy and poor countries, whether friend or foe. When the Supreme Court ruled these to be illegal, he reimposed a 15% general increase using differing powers not yet tested in court. Uncertainty was reinforced by the president's dismissive attitude to Europe, his demands for the ownership of Greenland, the territory of a NATO ally, and his express view that the incursion of Ukraine by Russia was solely a problem for Europe. This is not the America that we have known. Vice President Vance also accused Europeans of being a greater threat to freedom in Europe than Russia. That's actually what he said. That was not only offensive, it was absurd in equal measure. It was President Putin, unless my memory fails me, who sent Russian troops to invade Ukraine, not vice versa. It is Russia and Putin that conducts a shadow war of misinformation, takes cyber action aimed at Western Europe, and murders political opponents both within Russia and, as we saw at Salisbury, in the United Kingdom and other territories as well. When President Zelensky visited the White House to seek support, he was ambushed. No other description suffices by President Trump and Vice President Vance. It was Zelensky, not Putin, who was accused of gambling with World War III. That turned truth on its head. Yet when President Putin arrived in Washington, he was greeted with full honors. Putin reveled in his red carpet reception and appeared able to persuade President Trump that black was white. President Trump's priority is set out in two alluring slogans: America first and Make America Great Again. This explicitly puts self-interest before the wider international interest and has begun to further pry apart the rules-based system that was built and led by America herself. That system was fraying It is now fracturing. If diplomacy, consultation, and cooperation breaks down, we will be moving towards the law of the jungle, with which no country should be content and in which no country is safe. My fear is the risk of stepping into a world in which might is right and the mighty behave in an unprincipled or a lawless manner. In such a world, the rights and prosperity of weaker nations are subordinate to the will of the strong. Greater powers are deferred to, not because they have justice on their side, but because they have the power to compel acceptance of their will. Such a concept is truly terrifying. And how different is that from our expectations? In 1949, 1 year after the Marshall Plan was put in action, the NATO treaty was signed. That treaty included an Article 5 agreement that an attack on one member of NATO will bring all the other members to their defense. But is that still so? Will America, with all her military power, still be willing to come to the defense of a NATO ally? NATO is, of course, a defensive, not an offensive alliance. I hope they will. But the Vice President is on record as saying, I quote, "I just hate bailing out Europe again." The Defense Secretary added, I quote again, "I fully share your loathing." Were those remarks merely frustration, or were they voicing future policy? It is striking that neither comment was disowned by the President. Consider, if America did resile from Article 5, it is hard to see how an American could remain as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Yet it is inconceivable, given America's great military power, to imagine anyone other than an American leading NATO as it is currently constituted. So what underlies all this? I suspect underlying it is America's determination that Europe shall bear a higher share of NATO's overall costs. And that would be fair. The burden has fallen too heavily and for too long on America's shoulders. American power was vital in winning both world wars in the last century. Although history reminds us that she joined World War I only in 1917, after German submarines had sunk American ships. And in World War II, only after Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1941. So the worry for the future, to voice the private fear, is that past American presidents only gained the support of their public, of the American nation, to enter the two world wars after America herself was attacked. In future, without that imperative, can we be utterly confident of American participation? I hope we can. President Trump, against his own campaign oratory, has shown himself prepared to use America's muscular power on overseas missions. I am conflicted by the American-Israeli attack on Iran. In one sense, this was a wholly understandable response to Iran's behavior over many decades. I've no illusions about the distasteful nature of Iran's clerical leadership. They unleash terror, and they fund murder and mayhem through their proxies across the Middle East. It is a brutal regime. A regime that has shown it is willing to murder any of its own citizens who are brave enough to protest at the misgovernment that scars their lives. So, that being said, why am I conflicted? It is because of what was not done ahead of military action, and crucially, the wider implications that lay beyond that. There was no diplomatic attempt to obtain a United Nations resolution to give international legality to this war. No nation other than Israel was even consulted about the fact of this war. And that was despite the fact that the war was absolutely certain to have much wider repercussions across the Middle East and beyond, as we are now seeing day after day. Many nations will pay a price for this war. And hostilities, I fear, will not end when bombing stops. Old hatreds will linger. New hatreds will have been born by what has happened in this war and other recent events. A new generation may have been radicalized. Retaliation may be deferred, but it is likely to come. This war will have a long tail. Its aims have never been clear. And since the conflict began, they have been changing by the day. No exit strategy is known. It may exist, but it is not known. The president demanded surrender. He is very unlikely to get it. For Iran, I think when you think of Iran, you should think of Persia and remember her history. Persia was a dominant world power when our country, the United Kingdom and America, was still living in mud huts. So they will not admit defeat. Neither America nor Israel were prepared in this war in the terminology to put boots on the ground, to send in ground troops to fight. This comforted their domestic audiences, but made regime change, which at the start was said to be one of the aims of the war, that was swiftly changed. That comforted their audiences, but made regime change always unlikely, completely impossible. Whilst they restricted conflict to the air, some American leaders encouraged Iranian citizens to take to the streets and confront well-armed Basij volunteers. Basij volunteers are part of the Revolutionary Guard, which murdered 30,000 demonstrators only weeks ago. Unless and until the Iranian regime is seriously tottering, that encouragement for the citizenry to rise up is an invitation to suicide. In due time, this war will end. What will it have done for the rule of law and the protection of the rules-based system of behavior that has served the world so well in the aftermath of the Second World War? The American Defense Secretary was contemptuous, I quote, of vague notions of international law, and I quote again, stupid rules of engagement. So what does that mean? Such disregard of law, forgive me being blunt about this, such disregard of law is a shameful example for a lawmaker to set. If the international rule of law is dismissed so casually, what are we left with? I can only speculate, but I believe we will be left with a more fearful world in which wars may be more numerous and alliances less secure. It'll be a world in which disputes are settled not with diplomacy or adjudication or agreement, but by force, the victor being the most militarily or economically powerful. This heralds a playground for the strong, perhaps Russia, perhaps China, or even America, and a future of unease, even fear, for the weaker nations. That would be a wretched legacy to pass on to the next generation. The mercurial nature of President Trump upends the accepted laws and norms of diplomacy. But the message for the UK and for our friends in Europe is clear and unmistakable. We must plan and enact policies to improve self-dependence, especially insofar as defence is concerned. And this will require us to raise budgets to enhance our military capacity, our capacity for defence and offence, of course, And that effort must be made within NATO and not separate from it. It will be an expensive and a long-term commitment. After decades of peace, governments must now persuade their electorates that military spending must rise, perhaps at the expense of social expenditure or higher taxation. And assuming that can be done, countries must then agree to purchase arms collectively. And in doing so, the weapons must be interoperable on land, on air, on sea, and below the sea. That will mean purchases from national suppliers may be less easy to justify. Matters such as these, complex as they are, cannot be left undecided if NATO is to be battle-ready and a credible deterrent to any hostile intent. Do not please misunderstand me. I do not in any way wish to push America aside. She remains the most important ally to the whole of Europe. For the United Kingdom, the transatlantic partnership is key to our security and our intelligence. It is in our British national interest to sustain this relationship, even if we are in dispute on other issues. And number 10, during Gulf War I experienced at first hand what could be achieved when working closely with what I thought was the finest foreign policy team America has had. George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, together with James Baker as Secretary of State, and Brent Scowcroft as well. President Bush and I never held back from speaking truth to each other, and never once did that impair our relationship in any way. But today, there is a tendency to tiptoe around President Trump to avoid upsetting him. Although I understand that, I do not agree with it. Sovereign states that demean themselves in this fashion will soon be seen as subordinates and not allies. That is not a role for the United Kingdom. If we disagree with American policy, we should say so, as a friend that cares for the well-being of an ally. Statesmen do this in private, not in public or on social media. Our frankness may cause uncomfortable interludes, but we must never lose sight of what is morally decent and right, and stand up for what we believe. In all our long years of history, that is what the United Kingdom has done. It was right then, and it is right now. Let me return, finally, to the words of Clement Attlee. And I quote, "Peace does not come about through wishful thinking. Peace is not just a negative absence of war. Peace means you can get rid, as far as you can, of the causes of war." End of quote. What do we mean by peace? Seems an easy question, but it isn't. To fully enjoy peace, men and women need to be free. By free, I don't only mean to be at liberty. I mean to be free of war, free of fear, free of want. I mean freedom to worship without persecution, and freedom to speak out against injustice and oppression. The concept of peace is wide-ranging. Peace of mind is very precious, but in our 21st century, a majority of people in the world don't enjoy it. The growth of stress, of pressure, of mental health tells us we're very far from that ideal. In other areas, there has been progress. Many diseases that killed or crippled have been overcome. Child mortality has fallen dramatically. Hundreds of millions of people have moved out of dire poverty. Similar numbers now have piped fresh water and electricity. But as rich nations reduce their aid budgets, poor nations continue to struggle. And the international liberal order loses its attraction and its potency. There is an ancient responsibility upon every generation to leave behind a better world than the one they inherited. We are not doing very well on that front. Our young generation, in our country now I speak of, our young generation has no direct experience of war. They have grown up in a far better environment. They travel more, intermingle more, intermarry more. They are blind to colour and ethnic backgrounds. They are free of many of the inhibitions and prejudices of their forebears. They do not view ancient enmities through the same eyes as previous generations. They welcome communal action on issues like climate change that can only be overcome if the international community works together. Peace, said Mr. Attlee, does not come about through wishful thinking. Indeed not. Not in any form. It comes about by working together across borders and across boundaries with civility, respect, fortitude, and mutual understanding to diminish the causes of dispute and strife. If we truly wish to create a safer world, that is the route we must take. Thank you very much.
There was going to be a standing ovation for a moment there. Okay, well, we've got time for some questions. There are some roving mics. I will do my best to make this as efficient as possible. Can you please give us your name and any affiliation? And I see a hand up right there immediately. That's it right there.
Hello there, thank you. Sam Walker, King's graduate, 1991. Sir John, I worked for you in 1992 on the election campaign. And I would like to say that I think time has been very kind to both of us. But one of the things that really struck me in your remarks this evening, you talked a lot about working together. One of the things that I think ties a Prime Minister's hands behind their back, and certainly did for you in 92 to 97, was the inability of the party really to work together. And I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on how difficult it is to be leading a party, appointing a cabinet from a group of people that you don't really choose yourself. And that contrasts very heavily with life in the real world, where a CEO is in charge of everything within the organisation. So in the spirit of reform, which came up again a few times, how do you think that the political system that we have today can reform itself to make sure that there is greater opportunity for leadership at the top, and that the troops that you have in your cabinet and in the rest of your parliamentary party do actually stand behind you and work together with you?
Thank you.
Well, you're quite right about the difficulty of maintaining your party marching in the same direction. And that has been a problem with every government I can remember since I was in swaddling clothes. It is a real problem. It was made particularly difficult in 92 to 97, because with the majority in votes that we obtained, we should have had a majority of 70, whereas in fact we had a majority of 21, of whom 30 were unsound on every issue. So it was a bit tricky. We were in effect a minority party, particularly on European matters, right from the start. I think there are several things. People are disdainful of going into politics these days. There are many people who would be ideally suitable for politics, but they don't want to do it anymore. I mean, let's have a little question. How many people here, particularly the young present, would actually wish to go into politics as a career? Hands up, please. Oh, well, that's way above the average. I normally only get 4 or 5. Very good. King's is obviously a very good influence on democracy. But even so, a very small number of people. So I think we have to look at the system and how it works. The House of Commons is distinctly adversarial. The two front benches are two sword lengths apart, precisely, going back to the days where they might draw their swords and slaughter one another, which often crossed my mind during those years in Downing Street. I do think we have to look at the system. And I also think it helps enormously if politics is seen as a public service, not a swill where people enter it in order to make some advances, become a minister, and then go off and earn some money elsewhere. We need also to look at trying to encourage more people to get into politics who would be suitable for it. There's a tendency these days to, well, both parties haven't got the spread of people that once they had. You'll stretch to find many military men or many businessmen sitting on the Conservative benches these days. And actually, it'll be a stretch to find many people who are genuinely working class, who live in their constituencies and understand their problems because they have lived them in the Labour Party as well. You'll find instead a large number of well-educated young students who have good intentions, but don't actually live amongst their constituents when they were brought up and don't have the same understanding that I found when I first got into the House of Commons a long time ago. So I think we've got to try and make politics a more attractive place for people to go. It seems to have become very unattractive, particularly for women members. A number of them left because of the atmosphere in the Commons at the last election. The key to so much in politics is the example that politics sets. If politics sets a good example, if the country is going well, it reflects all the way down. If it's not, that also reflects all the way down. So I'm afraid much will change in this country once we are back to a period of steady growth. We haven't been for some time. During the in the 92 election, we were just coming into a recession. It was very kind of my predecessors to hand me a recession, but they did. But when we left, we handed on 3.5% growth, which went on for some years. And that changes the whole atmosphere of the country. It also provides resources to do the things that you need to be done. So you can change politics almost at a stroke as soon as you're in a position of healthy growth. But I do think, as I said, there are reforms to be made within Parliament. I only scratched the surface of those. That's a much more detailed and probably boring discussion. But there are reforms to be made in how the Commons works, how the Lords works, and how the relationship works. All that is part of the change that I think is going to be needed.
Thank you. Who have we got? There we go. We've got one down the front here, please. Lots and lots of questions. I'll try and make it as geographically equal as possible.
Thank you, Sir John. Aidan Flynn, University of Staffordshire. Very briefly before my question, can I take the opportunity, I've waited a long time for it, to thank you for your earnest work with Mr. Reynolds, the late Peter Brook and others on peace in Northern Ireland. For me, as someone living in Ulster, but not the Northern Ireland bit of Ulster, it was great. I can only imagine how much greater it was for those on the other side of the border and how it transformed their lives. So that my many nephews and nieces now just live in a completely and utterly different world. And your efforts do not go unnoticed right across the island of Ireland. We were very fortunate that you came when you did come to the position of number 10 Downing Street occupant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And the question is something totally different and perhaps more straightforward. You were an intervener in the Miller number 2 case in the Supreme Court. And as law happens to be my own area, I'm just interested not so much on the specifics of why you became an intervener in the court case, but could you reflect briefly on what is it like to be a participant in a Supreme Court case as an intervener?
Ah, the Supreme Court, yes. Gina Miller brought the case first. But the background to this, I was doing an interview on the Today, I think it was the Today programme, and there was a suggestion that the then Prime Minister was going to bypass the law in order to prevent votes being taken on Brexit. And I said publicly that if there was indications that he was going to do that, I would take the matter to the Supreme Court, because I thought it was improper to interfere in that fashion with the working of Parliament. And that is actually what I did. I didn't actually have to appear in court. I had a Queen's Counsel who presented the case. And because I felt strongly about it, I proceeded with that case. I didn't wish to cause further division within the Conservative Party, so I kept well below the radar in doing so. And I thought that was the right thing to do. But we did win the case in the Supreme Court by a 13-0 decision. So I think it was probably a good case to have taken to them. And I did it because I thought it was constitutionally necessary, because governments may be given power, but they do not have power outside the law. And once you get outside the law, in whatever way, you are in uncharted territory. Once it begins to be accepted, you chip away at the law, someone else will take a bigger chip, and then a bigger chip, and then a bigger chip, and suddenly the law is taken as something that can be bypassed and ignored, and that is just not acceptable in a democracy. So that's why I did it.
Okay, what have we got? We've got one there, please. Yeah. You got a mic coming.
My name's Nick Farndon. I've got no affiliation to the college, but I am living in St John's former constituency. My question, and I was quite intrigued by what you were saying about examining the political system, particularly with reference to the electoral system, and I think about the result of the 2024 election, where you have a Labour majority with just over a third of the vote and almost 2/3 of the seats. And we're now looking at perhaps the next election where you have 5 parties that may be competitive, which could frankly result in an electoral casino. Anything could happen. Crazy, disproportionate results. May I press you to find out, is it that you're open-minded, or are you slightly further down the path towards supporting electoral reform?
All my life I've supported first past the post. And I did so because we were essentially a 2-3-party system. The last election produced a number of elections in the last, well, since 1983, elections had produced distorted results if you match the number of seats gained by the winning party to their share of the vote. It is a distortion that has been growing. It wasn't just with the 24 election. The 24 election was unique in one way. The Labour Party had a huge majority of well over 200 on 35% of the vote. 35% of the vote would have enabled them to lose every election in the previous 150 years. And yet it produced a majority of that massive size. I think actually the Prime Minister might have wished the size was a little smaller. It would have been a little more manageable, but that is, size of having too big a majority is something I can only dream of. So I certainly envy him for it. Have I decided we should move to first past the post? No, I haven't. Do I think that we cannot continue as we are if the size of the vote from the 3 major parties continues to stay at its present low level? I don't think that would be constitutionally proper. Do I imagine there will be a swift response from the parties who would be giving up the advantages of first past the post? Altruistic they may be, but maybe not that altruistic. I think it would take quite a time to actually get a decision, but I think there is a debate to be had that is returning to the political classes now because of the disproportion between the number of seats you can gain and the proportion of vote that you are entrusted with. So I don't think it's going to happen quickly, but I think it is once again becoming an issue for discussion.
Thank you. Over this side. I can see right at the back there, please. There you go. That's it. As far away as possible for you, Sean, all right?
Hi, John. It's really great to have you. Also, a big thank you to the Strand Group for organising this event. My name is Ava, and I work for the Treasury, although my question is a personal one, of course. My question is in relation to the recent escalations in the Middle East, and thank you very much for your support to the Iranian people. I'm a British Iranian, and it's been really, crazy few weeks because my father lives in Iran, and it's been really difficult not being able to get hold of him properly, and also friends. It would be really good to know if you were Prime Minister, what your response would have been to the strikes, but also do you support Keir Starmer's approach to this so far?
I think the Prime Minister's taken the right decision. Had I been Prime Minister, and had I been invited to join, the first thing I would have wanted to know was whether we were going to get a United Nations resolution and whether we were going to seek an international coalition. I was Prime Minister for the first Gulf War, and that's exactly what we did do. It was largely George Bush. I had been Prime Minister for 3 weeks, so I can't take much credit for it. But he did seek and produce the most extraordinary coalition of nations right across the Middle East. The background, you may recall, was that Iraq had invaded Kuwait and was planning to move down the Gulf, so it controlled the whole of Gulf oil. And apart from the fact that that was internationally illegal, it would have been devastating to the world economy. So there was no choice but to take action, and I didn't have the slightest hesitation about it. But we did need to make sure that we had the support of the international community, because the law matters. And that is why we sought a United Nations resolution, which we obtained. And we also obtained the actual practical support of a huge number of nations who were fighting with the Anglo-American coalition in order to defeat Saddam Hussein. And I think that was a template that should have been followed on this occasion. And I think had it been so, it would have been interesting to see how it fell out.
Thank you. You.
Thanks. My name's Robert Orchard. I'm a former BBC political journalist. I covered your leadership campaign in 1990, amongst many other things. A very interesting speech. You said a number of fascinating things, Sir John, but two of them struck me as quite extraordinary for a leading Conservative. One was your suggestion that the electoral system might need a fresh look, which I think is the first time I've heard a leading Conservative say that. I won't go further on that as it's been looked into slightly. I'll ask you two questions, if I may. The other one was your suggestion that isn't it really time for us to admit that Brexit has failed to deliver. I presume that's a heartfelt plea to your own party as much as to anyone. I wonder if you'd like to enlarge on whether you'll be saying that a bit more loudly and publicly. And the other question, really, given where we are with 5 or 6 party politics, if you include Wales and Scotland, do you see the likelihood, or certainly the possibility, of us having to have another coalition government after the election? And do you think the British people have just got to start getting used to the idea of coalition?
Robert was like that in our class, so I knew.
Well, there were quite a few questions in that. If I can take, I think when you said 2, a little mathematical choice would suggest more. As far as Brexit is concerned, I've been saying that loudly and clearly since 2016. So will I continue to say it? I emphatically will. I don't think we can rejoin the European Union for a raft of technical and good reasons. But I do think it is in the economic interests of this country and the wallets of the people and wallets and purses of people in this country to regain that £100 billion worth of trade with Europe and the £40 billion worth of tax yield that would provide to the government. So yes, I will continue to say that. As far as the question of first past the post is concerned, when conditions change, when circumstances change, I change my mind. I've always supported first past the post. But if we go on in the present form, with the present sort of voting, then it would not be sustainable democratically, I think. Are we likely to have a coalition government after the next election? I would say it's highly likely. Unless there's a significant change in the opinion polls from where they are at the moment, I think a coalition government is probably the most likely outcome. But we are still in the first half of a parliament. It can change dramatically. There may have been more questions. Have I missed anything?
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, right on the end there. Yeah.
Hello, Julian Samways. I was a parliamentary candidate for the Conservatives in 1992. Didn't get elected, and now run my own.
I'm sorry, Julian.
Thank you very much. I now run my own business, and I think it's fair to say that both parties recently, Labour and Conservative, policies have been disastrous for small business, and you add to that leaving the European Union too. Bearing in mind growth is at the heart of many of the problems we face today. What would you be doing if you were Prime Minister or indeed Chancellor now to get growth back in the economy? And what advice would you be giving to the Conservative Party, who seems to have abandoned their core tenet, their raison d'etre of economic competence, and seem to be following other paths like cultural wars and things like that, rather than really focusing on that, which is the path, I think, for the Conservatives getting back towards power at least?
Well, I think I'd be looking at policies that incentivise investment. I mean, it's very easy to say, well, we have a big heart, we're going to spend money on this and that and all sorts of other things. But we actually have to earn that money before we can spend it, or we're going to find 2 years down the road we can't continue as we had been in the past. So I would be looking at an incentivised series of economic policies, and we can go into technicalities about it, but perhaps not now. But that is the structural point. I think at the moment we have disincentivized with things like the national insurance increase, which I think was a grave mistake. The country marches on the activities of small business by and large. There are huge numbers of them. And people who go in and start a small business of their own with 3 or 4 people or 5 people or 20 people, they are immensely brave. They're putting the whole assets of their life at risk and at stake in doing so. And we ought to be making life more comfortable for them to succeed and not more difficult for them to succeed. So I do think in that sense, policy is at present going in the wrong direction. As far as advice for the Conservative Party is concerned, I prefer to keep my family quarrels private.
What have we got? Right there, please. Yeah.
Hi, Sir John. Thank you so much for coming. I'm formerly of this parish, so I would ask, and I think I know the answer I may get because you're a Conservative, but I think the speech that Mark Carney made of trade a month or 2 ago about the rules-based international order and the sign in the shop window and the kind of collective beliefs that many Western liberal democracies have about trade and other issues have. I thought that was interesting, and I thought it sort of typified a lot of the changing beliefs that you might see in the public. And what I want to ask is, when you see institutions and other beliefs like your rules-based international order, liberal democracy in general, and slogans like long-term economic plan, strong economy for stronger NHS, is it not the most compassionate thing when an institution is on life support to kill it?
Which institution did you mean?
So that could be anything for military alliances, political parties, beliefs in general.
If something's suffering, I'd prefer to see if we can repair it before we kill it. In some cases, you may say it'd be a mercy killing, but by and large, I would prefer to sustain things. I actually grew up with the international liberal order, with the extent that we live in a world where we are not an island except geographically. What happens to our well-being depends on what happens overseas. If they're not buying our goods, we're in deep trouble. And a million other examples we can give. So I very much favour the liberal system that we have had over the past 50 years. And I think it is a tragedy that parts of it seem to be breaking up, both in terms of the law and in some cases in terms of trade. The World Trade Organization is now pushed to one side. The United Nations is being pushed to one side. And people say, well, the United Nations is failing. Well, if the United Nations is failing, I will tell you exactly why. because the 5 permanent members of the United Nations can between them veto almost anything that's worthwhile. And in many cases, Russia or China, and sometimes the United States, not so much France and Britain, they do veto things. The whole purpose of the United Nations when it set out, the underlying purpose that sent Roosevelt to his last summit was to finalize agreement with Stalin, who was dragging his heels about it, to actually set up the United Nations. I'm afraid we live in a world where we operate collectively with other people, or we all lose out. If we return back to a world in which every nation state is an island unto itself, and there's less cooperation and more disagreement between them, then we're moving into a very difficult and unsafe world indeed. So yes, call it a romantic look at the past, but I think we should save the liberal establishment. I don't mean the individuals, I mean the system, if we possibly can, and I very much regret that it's been under such attack. It's not just in the last 4 years. It's not just President Trump, as some people say. It began some way before then. And if you look across the world, find me a leader in Europe or elsewhere who could bring the world together to rebuild something as impressive as the United Nations and the rest of the post-war system of government. There is no one that I can see around the world who could do that. It was done, led by Roosevelt and others, at the end of a war, when people perhaps were more inclined to do something dramatic. But if we let it fray, if we let it fall away, it's going to be a great loss to us in this country, certainly, but also to the world as a whole. And so I'm very much in favor of trying to stitch together the things that are broken or replace them with something else that will work even better. I'm not in favor of standing back saying, well, it doesn't really matter, we'll let that institution collapse, we'll let that agreement collapse. I don't think that's the way to proceed at all.
For the last question, I'm going to exercise Chair's prerogative, and I'm going to ask myself. Sir John, we all know that these are sobering times, and that was a sobering lecture. Where are the sources of optimism?
The young. I think the young are the sources of optimism. They haven't lived through all the things that have made so many people sour over the years. And they've actually been very badly treated in the last 10 years or so. You consider the things that are different for the young. They no longer go into jobs that are likely to be lifelong. They no longer have pensions that are likely to be lifelong. They now have to pay a substantial amount of money if they go to university, and they come out with a debt. When they reach £28,000 or whatever it is, they start repaying that debt at exactly the time in their life when they ought to be trying to buy a house and perhaps beginning to start a family. It's no surprise to me that the birth rate is falling. There's still lots of people in their late 20s and 30s who are still living at home because they can't afford to live anywhere else. And we've seen that trend in other countries as well. But they have to be our source of optimism. And I think nothing lasts forever. There are periods where the world is doing well and periods where it's not doing so well. We haven't been doing so well since the economic problems of 2007 to 8, which have cast a very long shadow. It's now 19 years beyond that. It's time we came out of it. I am modestly optimistic that we're through the worst in the United Kingdom. It's not going to be brilliant, but I think what hasn't happened can cheer us up. We haven't collapsed back into recession despite several external knocks that could have pushed us there. I think that's a cause for opposition, for optimism. And I think there are other things. I don't know how everyone's very worried about artificial intelligence. What I know about artificial intelligence, you could write on a postage stamp with an elephant's hoof. So I've got no optimism falling out of that, but other people have. So I think it will change because things do change. You can't often know exactly when or why or how, but they just do. And I'm optimistic enough to think they will change. And we've been in a trough for so long, I think we're due some better good fortune. Imagine the change. If the war in Ukraine were to end, the degree of optimism that that would bring, if the Middle East could settle down, and there are reasons to suppose that it might, if those two things happen, you'd suddenly be in a different world, and a world in which people felt wholly more optimistic. So I don't despair. I think we will come out of this, and it will get better. I just can't quite tell you how it's going to happen, which is a small defect in the argument.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. I'm sure you'll agree. A real tour de force. Before the round of applause, can I invite once again Alan Evans up just to give the vote of thanks.
Well, thank you, Sir John, for that superb lecture. It's a great privilege to have been here and to heard that. It falls to me to thank everyone for coming and to thank some particular people who made this possible. I'd particularly like to thank my trustees from the Attlee Foundation who did all the work behind the scene. If you liked what you heard, please do think about donating to the foundation. We have no other sources of funding to support the work that we do, particularly with disadvantaged people in East London. My trustees will be at the reception afterwards. I'd particularly like to thank John and all of his staff at the Strand group. They do a superb professional job, and these occasions are always well worth coming to. And I'd also like to thank Sir John's office, who were a privilege and a pleasure to work with, and I think we made a good team, the three parts of this to lay on this evening. But most of all, thank you, Sir John, for your thoughtful comments, and particularly I thought the comments you made on America, comparing the relationship now compared with 30 years ago when you dealt with the Americans and 80 years ago when Clem dealt with them. If I may, I'll just end with one story about Attlee. And John Davis early on referred to the fact that Sir John, Clem Attlee and I are great cricket fans. And there's a story about Attlee soon after he became Prime Minister. And the one thing he didn't like was dealing with the media. He would have hated spin doctors and briefing and leaking and so on and so forth. So he made one decision, which was to appoint a man called Francis Williams to be his press secretary. And the only thing he asked of Williams was, keep the press away from me, deal with them. And so Williams did this and did it quite well. But quite early in the Premiership, Williams decided it'd be a good idea to have at number 10 a telex machine so you could keep up to date with political news. So he went to the Prime Minister and approached him. He said, would it be okay if we paid for a telex machine in number 10? And he could see from Attlee's face that Attlee was unimpressed by this idea. And Attlee said, well, what's the point of that? And Williams said, well, something like, it's, you can keep up to date with British political news and international development. And Williams could see that he was losing Attlee's concentration. So he paused. And he said, Prime Minister, you do know that telex machines have up-to-date cricket scores on them. Williams got his machine straight away. So John, thank you so much for delivering the Attlee Foundation lecture. We are deeply honoured and deeply grateful, and I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Sir John for the lecture.